Hi everyone, is it possible to identify the legendary King Arthur as a real historical figure? Well, in my opinion, King Arthur can be very securely identified with a figure called Athrwys, son of Meurig, and he's accepted as a historical prince from southeast Wales in the post-Roman period. But was he King Arthur? Well, this theory doesn't originate with me. It actually goes back at least as far as 1747, when a historian called Thomas Cart suggested, perhaps for the first time, that Athrwys was in fact the historical King Arthur. And there have been various people over the centuries since then who have also proposed this same identification. But what's the evidence for it? Does it stand up to scrutiny? Well, in my opinion, obviously, I would say it does, but what is the evidence for it? Okay, so I'll present the evidence for it, and then you can make up your own mind. So the evidence, in my opinion, comes down to chronology, power, geography, and family members. So let's start first with geography. Now, as I said before, Athrwys, son of Meurig, was a prince of southeast Wales. He was a prince of the kingdoms of Glamorgan, or Glywysing as it was then known, and Gwent, and also Yrging. So basically we can say southeast Wales, just for ease of reference. So this is an area which has long been associated with King Arthur. Sorry, excuse the birds. So the earliest definite reference to Arthur comes from the Historia Brittonum, which records his 12 battles. But attached to the back of that document there's the Wonders of Britain, which also mention Arthur twice. So in the Historia Brittonum, lots of people have tried to identify the locations of these battle sites to try to pin down where Arthur was based. The problem, though, is that they're military campaigns, and Arthur could have been campaigning far away from his home territory. So while they could be used to try to ascertain where Arthur was active, they don't prove where he actually lived. And with the Wonders of Britain, one of the two references to Arthur is in the context of a boar hunt. So again, Arthur could have been far away from where he was actually based. The only reference to Arthur in the Historia Brittonum and the Wonders of Britain, taken as a single entity, is the Wonder of Britain, which is the grave of Arthur's son. So in that entry, we read about how Arthur is said to have killed his son, and his grave was in Yrging. There's no reference to Arthur being on a military campaign or a boar hunt or anything like that. There's no reference to anything which would suggest that he was far away from his own kingdom or where he was actually based. So of all the references to Arthur in this earliest source for Arthur's career, this is the reference which most strongly indicates where Arthur himself was actually based, and it's Yrging. Now, if you remember, Yrging was one of the three main territories making up Athrwys' kingdom, Glywysing, Gwent and Yrging, all around southeast Wales. So the evidence from this earliest Arthurian source points to Athrwys and Arthur being based in the same part of the country, around southeast Wales. And that's supported by later traditions as well. For example, the Lives of the Saints, which are basically biographies about religious figures of the Dark Ages. Several of them mention Arthur, and the ones that mention Arthur tend to place him in around southeast Wales, or areas in the vicinity, but it's all kind of focused on southeast Wales. For example, he turns up twice in the Life of St. Cadog, and this is particularly interesting because the two appearances of him are separated by many decades. So his second appearance, when Arthur is still alive as king, means that his first appearance must have been when he was quite young. So if he was active in southeast Wales, because that's where the Life of St. Cadog is set, it's set in Glywysing and Gwent, then, and Arthur was present there as a youth and as a reigning king, that indicates that that was his territory, that was where he lived. And like I said, he does appear in other lives of the saints, like the Life of Saint Illtyd, and that describes how Illtyd travelled from Brittany to Arthur's kingdom, and he serves in Arthur's court. And then immediately after leaving Arthur's court, he turns up at the court of one of the minor kings of Glamorgan. So again, that suggests that Arthur was active in southeast Wales, not just active, but that was actually where his royal courts were. That was his kingdom. The same can be said about Welsh tradition. Welsh tradition places Arthur's apparently main court at a place called Cerllwig in Cernyl. Now, I've done previous videos showing that Cernyl, in an Arthurian context, is almost certainly a region in southeast Wales, not Cornwall, as it's normally translated. And there are references to a Cerllwig in that very area. So logically, that would be the Cerllwig of Arthurian tradition. That would be Cerllwig, the court of King Arthur. In the tale Cilch and Olwen, Arthur's men are chasing a monstrous boar across South Wales, from the southwest all the way across above Glamorgan. And then when it's above Glamorgan, Arthur declares that he will not let it enter Cerllwig. So then he orders his men to push the boar into the Severn. Now bear in mind, this boar can swim. Earlier it had travelled from Ireland to Wales. So simply being in the water doesn't mean anything. It won't stop it. But yet Arthur declares to his men to push the boar into the Severn to stop it from reaching Cerllwig. So if Cerllwig was in Cornwall, why would he do that? That's just pushing it closer towards Cerllwig. Whereas if we understand Cerllwig as being the Cerllwig in southeast Wales, then that whole narrative makes perfect sense. So in terms of geography, when we look at the earliest accounts about King Arthur, I would say that they strongly support the conclusion that Arthur was based in southeast Wales. Yes, he went on campaigns far away from that area, but that was where his own kingdom, his own land was. It was southeast Wales, which means that he lived in the same place as Athrwys, son of Meurig. But now we come to the second point, were they contemporaries? Because a very common chronology found these days in modern sources is that Athrwys was a 7th century king. So if that's right, then that means that he lived a whole century after King Arthur, so obviously he can't be King Arthur. So is this correct? Was he a 7th century king or a 6th century king? Well, the primary basis for the 7th century date is an entry in the Annals Cambriae, which is a 10th century Latin document. And in that document, in the entry for 775, we find the death of Fernvale, son of Aethel. And that name matches the great-grandson of Athrwys. Athrwys had a son called Morgan, who had a son called Aethel, who had a son called Fernvale. So the Fernvale, son of Aethel, in the Annals Cambriae, who died in 775, is presumed to be the great-grandson of Athrwys. If that's so, then Athrwys must have been a 7th century king. That's the primary basis for this late chronology. There are a few other little bits and pieces of evidence, but they're relatively minor, and I'll cover them in a future video, but the primary piece of evidence is this entry in the Annals Cambriae, and this is even admitted by scholar Patrick Sims-Williams in the Book of Llandaff as a historical source in 2019. So this is very current. There is, even until today, in the year 2025, no better primary piece of evidence for this late chronology than this. But is this really a secure piece of evidence? Well, as Sims-Williams himself admits, it's not really that secure, because the names Aethel and Fernvale were both common names. So there could easily have been repeated sequences of pairs of names. So the pairing Aethel and his son Fernvale, yes, it appears just a few generations after Athrwys, but that doesn't mean it didn't also appear a few generations later still. In fact, in the Harleian manuscript 3859, in the genealogies there, we find that Athrwys did have a later descendant who was also called Aethel. He could easily have had a son called Fernvale, given that that was a common name in the dynasty. So using this entry for Fernvale, son of Aethel, dying in 775 as proof, as a definitive anchor point for the dates of this dynasty, it's just not a solid basis. But is there any other, more solid basis? Well, there are actually various references to this dynasty, to the members of this dynasty, in documents such as the Lives of the Saints, the Book of Llandaff from the 12th century, and others as well. So in the Book of Llandaff, we find very clear explanation that Dubricius, who was around in the early 6th century, was followed by Tylo. So they were supposedly bishops of the See of Llandaff. Now it's commonly concluded today that there was no See of Llandaff in that early period, but nevertheless these were evidently prominent bishops of that area. They did exist, this is widely agreed. So whether they were specifically bishops of Llandaff or not, the point is, Dubricius was the prominent bishop in southeast Wales in the early 6th century. That's not controversial. He was followed by Tylo. Again, that's not controversial either. And this is explicitly what the Book of Llandaff says. And then Tylo was followed directly by Odosius, who happened to be Tylo's nephew. Now this is what the Book of Llandaff directly says. This is what the life of Saint Odosius says. But this is just assumed to be a mistake. There's no specific explanation for it. It's just assumed to be an error, a falsification from the later medieval period. For no specific reason in particular, there is no explanation for it. The point is that's what the evidence says, and the reason this is so important is because early in the tenure of Odosius as bishop, that's where we find Athrwys as king. And then Odosius was still bishop several generations later. So Odosius must have been fairly young, and Athrwys must have been around just at the start of his tenure as bishop. So with Dubricius being around in the early 6th century, being directly followed by Tylo, and Odosius being his nephew, that would place Athrwys in the 6th century. And that's again explicitly supported by the Book of Llandaff, where we find Athrwys as King of Gwent, with witnesses to a land grant who were disciples of Dubricius. And this is acknowledged as a kind of problem with the chronology as it's currently accepted, because it doesn't fit any Athrwys who's known to have lived in that time. It can't fit Athrwys, son of Meurig, because according to the conventional chronology, he was in the 7th century, whereas these disciples of Dubricius, who witnessed this land grant, must have been around in the 6th century because they were disciples of Dubricius. So this is just dismissed as an error, or it's dismissed as this being a different Athrwys, not Athrwys, son of Meurig, except the land grant itself calls him Athrwys, son of Meurig, so there is no ambiguity about who he was. It's the same Athrwys. So the evidence explicitly from the Book of Llandaff places Athrwys in the 6th century, not the 7th century. And this is again supported by other accounts in hagiographies, the lives of the saints. According to the life of Saint Cadog, Athrwys was 2 generations before Cadog, and according to all scholars, basically, Cadog was born around the beginning of the 6th century. His career was very much in the middle of the 6th century. So his birth must have been around about the beginning of the 6th century. And Athrwys, according to that very document, the life of Saint Cadog, was 2 generations above him. Even if we assume that these generations weren't very evenly spaced out, like maybe there were some brothers who were born a long time after each other, it would still place Athrwys in the 6th century. It's impossible to get anywhere near a 7th century date for Athrwys with this information. And again, in the life of Saint Dubricius, remember I said that he was around in the early 6th century, so his birth was in the latter half of the 5th century. In the life of Saint Dubricius, he's made a first cousin of a king called Gergonvower, who, according to the Book of Llandaff, was the maternal grandfather of Athrwys. So that would place Athrwys 2 generations forward from Dubricius. So again, that would place him in the early 6th century. Now, you might have noticed that this would place him still a little bit too late to be King Arthur, according to the generally accepted dates of Arthur's activities. Like, for example, the Battle of Badon is normally placed in about 500 or 516, while the Battle of Camlan is normally placed in 537 or 542. So that still wouldn't quite match the dates of Athrwys. Athrwys would appear to be a younger contemporary of Arthur. But I would argue that the earliest information about the Battle of Badon actually places it in the mid-6th century. And you can see my video here about that exact subject. And regarding the Battle of Camlan, the participants included Mordred, who was allegedly the nephew of Urien of Reged, who was famously a king in the latter half of the 6th century, even as late as just about 590. So how could he possibly have had a nephew who was already active in battle as early as 537? And then there's the reference in the life of St. Gildas, which explicitly places Arthur still alive as late as the late 560s or even the 570s, because he's still alive after Gildas is described as going to Ireland, which he did in the late 560s, and Arthur is presented as still being alive after Gildas returns. So obviously this requires a longer explanation. You can see some of my previous videos about this exact topic though. I'll put links in the description. But the point is, I would argue very firmly that Arthur was clearly born around about the beginning of the 6th century and continued living into the 570s, which is a perfect match for the dates for Athrwys. So far we've seen the chronology and we've seen the geography. Now I was planning on talking about all of those points I mentioned at the beginning, but I even have in front of me a list of 10 family members of King Arthur from the legends who, in my opinion, can be identified with historical figures from the family of Athrwys. I was going to talk about all of them, but this video is already long enough, so I'll leave that for a part 2. Who knows, maybe there'll even be 3 parts to this. It's a big subject, there's a lot of evidence for this connection, so there's a lot to talk about. So that's what we've seen so far. The chronology and geography of Athrwys matches the chronology and geography of King Arthur. And in the future, we'll see many more very important connections between the two figures. For now though, let me leave you with this question. When did Homer, the Greek poet, really live? Was he a poet of the 9th century, the 8th century, or the 7th century? Well, if you'd like to find out the answer, come back next time.